Welcome. This is Caroline Staten with Transition US, and just want to welcome everyone onto the call today about Just Transition with co-founder Mateo Nube of Movement Generation. And this call today is sponsored by Transition US. And Transition US is the national hub of the Transition Network, which is now in 50 countries around the world, and invite you to check out more about it at transitionus.org, and also transitionnetwork.org has information about the global movement. And I'm going to turn it over to Marissa Momartz, our Programs Director here at Transition US, and she'll be introducing our guest.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm so happy this teleseminar is happening because personally I believe that making social justice more explicit in our work is not only the right thing to do, it's also the only way our movement is going to become powerful enough to rise to the challenges of our time. And I'm very excited to welcome a friend and mentor, someone I deeply respect and admire, Mateo Nube of Movement Generation, to lead today's call. Mateo is one of the co-founders of the Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project. He was born and grew up in La Paz, Bolivia. Since moving to the San Francisco Bay Area, he has worked in the labor, environmental justice, and international solidarity movements. Mateo has spent the last 2 decades integrating concepts of popular education into his movement work. He is also a member of the Latin rock band Los Nadies. We're grateful Mateo has agreed to lead today's teleseminar because we respect and appreciate the work of Movement Generation and the other organizations he will be talking about, and because we recognize the need for more conversations on the link between transition and social justice. Our team at Transition US has begun exploring the connection between race, class, and ecology, as have a number of local transition initiatives and regional hubs in the US and around the world. And in doing this work, we've learned that it can bring up a lot of assumptions. So to get the most out of today's call, I invite us all to participate with an open mind and heart in the spirit of reflection and collaboration. And with that, I will turn it over to Mateo.
Great. Thank you so much, Marisa. Thank you so much, Caroline. I'm very excited and humbled and flattered to be having this conversation with folks from, if I gather correctly, not only from around the United States, but a few folks who are calling in actually from other parts of the world. I have a lot of admiration for the work of the Transition Towns movement, and a special respect for both Marisa and Caroline for the work Transition US. And as has been expressed, what I will be talking about today is this concept of a just transition, and I will both speak to it conceptually and give examples. And as you may hear in the backdrop, the garbage truck is just passing by our office. So it makes it real. I will be talking about zero waste, among other concepts. So the Ecology Center truck from Berkeley, California, where our office is located. Great. It moved on, so I will proceed. I will start by stating what I think is obvious, and which will serve as a platform of sorts conceptually for the conversation we'll be having today, which is that transition is inevitable. It's upon us, and I think it's one of the core reasons why all of us on this call are compelled to be doing the work we're already doing, because we're living at a highly pivotal moment in our planetary history, certainly in human history as it relates to human impact on the planet. So transition is inevitable, but justice is not. And that is what the conversation today is meant to really focus on, which is how is it that we ensure that the lens that we are bringing to the work that we're doing that is so important and pivotal is really centered around this concept of a just transition. And to ground us, I really want to state that the departure point of our analysis really informs our journey and our action. So how it is we come to think about what transition is, what we're transitioning out of and towards, and how it is that we got into the conundrum that we're facing on a planetary scale as well as locally and regionally is very central to how we then proceed with our work. So I really, amongst other things, want to share with you all how we at Movement Generation conceive of both the causes to this crisis, the solutions to the crisis, and the paths that get us towards the solutions. And as a starting point, I want to state that we firmly believe that social inequity is a form of ecological erosion. And that is not a metaphor. I mean it in a very literal sense. That if we apply an ecological systems thinking cap to our understanding of how we function as a society currently, we come to that conclusion. So that's one of the concepts that I really want to ask us to anchor our conversation in. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, I referenced the concept of zero waste. And I'm guessing that the majority of folks on this call have, amongst other things, probably more than once, probably many times, watched Annie Leonard's brilliant story of Stuff. And one of the things she really brings home in that is the concept of there is no way, right, as a way to really get us to take a deeper appreciation of what it means to center on the concept of zero waste that is so elegantly offered to us by how nature actually works. And I want to put forth that if we take the concept of zero waste to heart as we approach what we're doing, we need to be thinking of the concept of zero waste not only as it relates to stuff, but as it relates to peoples. And what I mean by that is that we live under an economic system that has predetermined that there are places and peoples that are actually completely disposable. And that unless we appreciate that that is part of the inherent logic of this dominant economy that you heard me reference as the banks and tanks economy, but we can also call it the growth economy, we can call it the suicidal economy, that unless we don't appreciate that there are full swaths of peoples, cultures, segments of society that have been deemed worthy of being sacrificed, of being disposed of, that we are not really taking this concept of zero waste to its full dimension. So those are some initial concepts that I wanted to put forth as I go forth. And I wanted to give a very specific example as a departure point. And I want to use the example of a player in this economy that I feel represents some of the contradictions I think that many of us grapple with as we start moving towards relocalization and living within our bioregions, and that is taking a corporate entity that, again, speaks to the contradictions about this economy. And and that company that I want to reference is Whole Foods. And I'm making an educated guess that most of us in the Transition Towns movement appreciate the contradiction of, as we're trying to build short chain exchange food systems where folks know where their food comes from and know who grows our food and how it is grown, and that the structure really incorporates dignity at every step of that food chain process. We see how Whole Foods in many ways has tried to apply a dominant economy logic to relocalization and use it for a profit-based motive. And we, I think, I'm guessing, share a critique of how that really isn't a solution. That's not transition as we see it applied well. And I want to take it a step further. I want to point out that in the last year, one of the really interesting and I feel key indicators of what it means to live in an economy that is not only deciding that there's places and species that are disposable and completely displaceable, but that there's peoples, and that when the Baltimore uprisings happened in the context of the movement for Black lives in this country. And when the folks in Baltimore said, no more, we will not tolerate how the police are destroying the lives of young, innocent Black folks in our city when Freddie Gray was killed by the police, Whole Foods made a decision. They went out in the streets and started distributing free food. But they didn't distribute it to the protesters on the streets. They distributed it to the National Guard who was occupying the streets of Baltimore. And I found this to be a highly emblematic and intentional expression of how this economy states again and again that there are segments of society that deserve to be disposed of and to be considered as not worthy. And I add to that the example that if you walk into Whole Foods today, you will actually buy artisanal cheese and God knows how many other things, I think farmed tilapia fish that are harvested by prison labor. And that is where I feel the contradictions of an economic system that is stating that there's a whole segment of society that doesn't matter and that we are either going to kill at will or imprison and use their labor to make more profit is really symptomatic of what I was describing as social inequity being a form of ecological erosion. So I give that somewhat long-winded example as a preface to getting into a deeper exposition of what we mean by a just transition and a deeper exposition as to our understanding of both the root cause of the crisis we're facing and the solutions that we're trying to move towards. So one of the things I deeply admire about the Transition Towns movement and its genesis and where it's moved towards, and it's something that we deeply share at Movement Generation, is the very simple and elegant and truism, true statement that what we need to return to is a right relationship with place. That we need to return to a reflexive, responsive, reciprocal relationship to home again. And to do so, we need to understand home well. And that for those of us that have grown up in cities in particular, it's about returning to an understanding of what are the true ecological boundaries of how home works well are. That we need to understand our watersheds and our food sheds and energy sheds and build human settlement around this deep understanding. What I want to add to that is that part of what I think we are all collectively attempting to do is to ensure that every person has the right to a productive livelihood. That we have the means at our disposal to collectively build a dignified life for ourselves within the context of this generative, responsive, reciprocal relationship to place. So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to manage home well. And I use the phrase manage home intentionally because if we look at the root of what the word economy means, we break it down into economy. Eco means home, literally. It comes from the Greek word that is in English phonetically pronounced oikos, but in Greek it's pronounced eco, and it means home. And ecology means knowledge of home. And I think you all are at the vanguard of in the U.S. context, trying to get folks who've grown up illiterate about home to return to proper knowledge of home. And economy simply means management of home. As actually, it doesn't mean GDP. It doesn't mean ticker tape running stock prices at the bottom of our TV screen. Those are all just manifestations of a particular kind of economy, but there are many ways to build economy. And the fact is that the dominant economy we have today has globalized mismanagement of home. And when I said that the departure point of our analysis informs our journey and our action, I said it because it's really, really important as we try to understand what are the impacts of this current dominant economy, it is important to understand how we got here, because how we got here informs the current logic and structure of what is playing out. And the fact is that the current economy is built on the backs and the blood of whole peoples who've been dispossessed of proper relationship with home. Whole populations have been dispossessed of land, of resources, of home. What do I mean by that? Is that when you build an economy that is premised on the centrality of growth and profit at all costs, what that means is that as you are trying to always build bigger and sell more and make more money, what that means is that inherent to your economy is a colonial logic, which is I need more resources to build more stuff to make more money. And what that has meant over the arc of the last 500 years certainly is that we have, what today is manifest as multinational corporations backed by whole armies saying like, I need the oil that is under the ground where you live, so I'm going to take that land away from you. And this colonial logic, this colonial economy, this banks and tanks economy, doesn't see a forest, for example. It sees timber waiting to be tilled. And we came to this moment, as we again appreciate if we think about, say, peak oil and the dependence on fossil fuels, through a process called the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution would not have happened without the slave trade. It would not have happened without land conquest. It would not have happened without the genocide of indigenous peoples on this continent. Why am I saying all this? Because the social structures that are still informing how we relate to each other today and about who has access to this economy and who doesn't, and who's considered disposable and who isn't, is inherently related to this, to the way that this economy has played out over time. And mismanagement starts here with this colonial imperial logic to the economy that has colonized not only our lands and our social systems, but our minds. So what that brings us to is that part of what in our view, our transitions movement is about is to, we are about reclaiming a right relationship with home. We're about reconnecting to home. But what does that mean in a social context where huge parts of society have literally been ruptured from relation to the land they live on, for example, and been moved to a whole new place, and in that new place are still dispossessed of, for the most part, access to land, access to capital, access to any capacity to really build a right to a productive livelihood. In this context, if we appreciate how the dominant economy has been built, one can then come to the conclusion that, and this is our view of movement generation, that the Black Lives Matter movement is a frontline struggle in the struggle for ecological justice. That the concept of Black Lives Matter is getting to the heart of this notion that there should be no sacrifice zones. That again, that the logic of capitalism is one that says that places and people can be exploited, and some can be forced into extinction, and that's deemed acceptable in the name of growth. And the concept of Black Lives Matter is challenging that frontally and saying, no, nobody is disposable. There is no way. Even when you send us into prisons or you confine us into ghettos, our lives still are full of dignity. And until we abolish the prison industrial complex, and until we challenge how cities have been constructed in this way that says some people live in misery and others live in complete, surrounded by amazing material wealth, we will not find true balance. And so that's, I think, trying to really bring home this notion that again, there is no way. What I'm trying to say by that is that that in the same way that we have come to a place where planned obsolescence and the height of disposable products is an emblem of what's wrong with our economy, and what, again, I think the Transition Towns movement is really challenging centrally. If we apply this to the social context, there is not only a tremendous garbage bin that is expressing itself through, say, the Pacific gyre and plastic in the ocean, but there are swaths of our population that have been confined to, to be very crass about it, the garbage bins of society. And that it behooves us, if we apply ecological systems thinking properly, to actually be thinking about not only the things that economy produces, but the impacts it has on people. So let me dig into that a bit deeper, which is that if we think about how any economy works, there are 5 pillars, you could say, that are central to any form of economy: a regenerative economy or a degenerative economy. All economies need these 5 things. They need resources, things through which we build things like homes, or things through which tools that we use to grow food. We need labor. We need work to make it happen. Then we need a purpose that informs kind of what our economy is arcing towards, what its core intent is. We need a worldview that justifies this purpose, and we need a form of governance. But I would argue, and the reason I gave this historical context to the current economy, the dominant economy, which is not the only economy, but it's the dominant one, this global mismanaged home economy, is that the way it extracts resources, or rather, the way it gathers resources is through extraction. It deploys labor through exploitation. Its purpose, as I said before, was profit and growth at all costs. And it has a worldview that then justifies its purpose. Individualism, consumerism, American exceptionalism, and I'd say white supremacy and patriarchy at the center of justifying this purpose. And its mode of governance is militarism and violence. That's why I gave the example of the National Guard and Whole Foods. There is a logic to war and militarism and violence that isn't a consequence in this economy. It's actually the central mode of governance. As I said before, you can't build an economy that's premised on growth without taking stuff like land and labor from other people, and not expect those folks to resist, either when you're taking things away or when you're then insisting over time again and again that they don't have a right to a productive livelihood. And that's why, what you see when you see Whole Foods giving food out to the National Guard, or you see the bloated size of spending on the military in the U.S., that's not a coincidence. That's actually central to the form of governance. Which then brings us to what are the 5 pillars of a regenerative economy? And those are, again, I mentioned resources, labor, purpose, worldview, governance. Resources can be gathered through an extractive mode. It has to be regenerative, right? It brings us back to the concept of zero waste, which again, I think Transition Towns movement is at the forefront of bringing that into the consciousness of folks in the United States. Our labor needs to be deployed through cooperation, not competition. And that's where I think the Transition Towns movement both is in certain ways at the vanguard, and in other ways isn't, because it isn't, I think, fully incorporating what I'm putting forth through this presentation, which is a deeply centralized appreciation of how racial justice and an understanding of class and gender needs to inform that in terms of access. And then the purpose of this regenerative economy is, taking care of all, people and place and planet. That's where I think concepts coming from permaculture are very useful. Earth care, people care, fair share, right? That's purpose. And then we need to create a whole worldview to support this regenerative form of economy. And traditional cultures from around the world historically have, for example, revered watershed, right? And that's just one way through which we built worldviews that tend towards care for all and tend towards reverence versus, it's the we versus the me. It's the us versus the mine. And then governance needs to be rooted in a sense of deep democracy, which returns me to one of the central points I've been making about social inequity as a form of ecological erosion. That I think for our transition towns movement to really take its work to the next level, we need to really incorporate the concept of reparations into our work. When we think of the word reparations, we can think of it as repairing our relations. And when I talked about historical context of how this economy arose and how it continues to play out, fact is that there are, as I said, whole swaths of the population that have been deemed not worthy of having access to, amongst other things, say, land. Which then brings me to the next point that I want to put forth, which is the idea that, so I'm arguing, when I talk about transition and justice, I'm arguing that justice needs to be at the center of our action logic, right? And to make it so, I would posit that land reform is the key ingredient that moves us towards really winning a just transition. What do I mean by that? Is that this economy has commodified everything for the purposes of profit. And it all ultimately centers around land. And we see that around our food systems, whereas we, I think, all know a handful of multinational corporations control everything from actual ownership of land to ownership of seed, ownership of transportation of food from farm to plate and all the rest. But another expression of how this tremendous lack of democracy around access and distribution to land is playing out in cities today, where you're seeing incredible gentrification and displacement happening in cities across the United States. And it's deeply related, amongst other things, as to how a profit-based mentality is being applied to, for example, the concept of greening cities and climate adaptation and mitigation. We're seeing cities being rebuilt around, for example, transit-oriented development. But if it happens around a market-based economy, what ends up playing out is that only folks who have a lot of money can live in quote-unquote greened cities. So where I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, what ends up happening is, say, in the span of the last decade or two, the black population in the city of San Francisco has been cut in half. Neighborhoods that were historically black have lost cores of their historic population because people can't afford to live there anymore. I live in Oakland, and the same thing is playing out here. And Oakland is the birthplace of the Black Panthers. I'm saying all of this because one of the rhetorical statements we like making at Movement Generation is that we need to break the chains of the market and return to the web of life. And as that relates to land, we need to decommodify land. And we need to really create full community access to land. And that's going to look different in different places. And I think many of you are already working in many of these arenas building land trusts, whether they're agricultural land trusts or whether they're housing land trusts. So there are many expressions to this work. But again, what it calls for is to a radically democratic conception of how we challenge notions of private property and how we challenge notions of who has access to land and who doesn't. I'll name one example, which is, we speak a lot in the U.S. about the generational loss of farmers. And we often point to these statistics that point to, a good portion of folks who lived in the U.S. 100 years ago working the land, and now that being a minuscule portion. The fact is, we have all the farmers that we need in the U.S. right now. We just don't call them farmers. We call them farm workers. And we call them farm workers because they actually don't control the land that they work on. So I say that purposely in a somewhat provocative way to get us to appreciate, again, folks who are invisibilized in this current economy. Because if we don't visualize those realities, we end up having what I think is a trend most of us are familiar with, which is what we see as, younger, middle class, upper middle class, white folks who are interested in going into agriculture being seen as the vanguard of people who care about tending the land in this country. And actually, we need to complicate that. And we need to appreciate, again, what I was saying, the many social nuances that are playing out as it relates to how land is managed and who has access. So as a way maybe of summarizing what I've shared thus far, and there are multiple other ideas I want to put forth, but I think what I'll do is land what I've shared thus far, open it up to questions, and then get into through the questions, amongst other things, get into specific examples of solutions as we see them playing out across the United States. I think what I'm trying to argue is a couple of things. One is that frontline communities who are experiencing the brunt of the damage of this banks and tanks economy, of this dominant economy, need to be at the forefront of the solution design. And I think that's one of the really exciting challenges for the transition towns movement in the U.S. right now. And that's why I'm very excited that this call was organized, and that's why, amongst other things, I chose to be very direct about linking the Black Lives Matter moment and the movement for Black Lives into this conversation, because it's one of the most important and transformational struggles that is playing out in the United States, and in our view is central to the struggle for ecological justice. And if we don't think of it in those terms, there are some gaps in our analysis that need to be, at a minimum, brought to the table and discussed. So again, this notion of frontline communities being at the forefront of solution design is really important. The second is this notion that I've been stating multiple times, that there can be no sacrifice zones. That if we're really going to get at the root of what is not working, if we're going to dismantle the bad and build the good, we can't substitute this dominant economy with new forms of economy that still allows for certain peoples and certain places to be sacrificed. Said another way, a solution that exacerbates other problems is not a solution. So we need to have a holistic design, and amongst other things, to get there, we need to have the multiplicity of voices in that solution design that need to be there at the front end to make it work. And I know this is complicated and hard, but it's a necessary challenge we need to step to get this right. And again, I think what I'm trying to really bring forth is that a race, class, and gender analysis needs to be central to how we approach transition towns work for this to happen. And we need to be asking some really important, hard questions, some of which we may not have immediate answers to, but the process is as important as the landing point often. So that I think is one of the things that I am hopeful that this call is part of fostering. And again, I'm appreciative of both Maris and Caroline's leadership in making it so. So again, I think I'm going to press pause with the full knowledge that there are specific examples I was going to speak and hope to speak through the question and answer period about examples like the Climate Justice Alliance and the Our Power campaign, and about locations like Detroit, Michigan, or Richmond, California, that are places where we're seeing the just transition movement blooming and setting some really good examples. But I'm also hopeful that through your questions, you may also name situations and examples that speak to this notion of a just transition. So again, I think I'm acknowledging that I shared a lot of the conceptual piece, and I'm choosing to, for the time being, press pause on getting specific about examples where that work is really expressing itself on the ground. But I'm hopeful that I can blend that into the question and answer period. So Caroline or Marisa, if you think it's appropriate, maybe I'll turn it over to you all to start managing the Q&A part of this.
Yes, thank you so much, Mateo. I know that this is a tight time frame to get so many concepts across. And so we'll open it up for questions for people who want more clarification and want to bring something to the table in terms of some of those examples that are happening in your community. Please now on your phone keypad, press 1 if you have a contribution or question to make. And so go ahead and do that on your phone keypad. And I'm going to call on Gail. Gail, you're mic'd, so please go ahead and ask your question. And then I also will call on a couple of others. I think we'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time, so Mateo gets a sense of sort of what's the feeling amongst participants. Go ahead, Gail.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for putting on this whole event. It's amazing and wonderful and divine timing for so many of us. I'm really grateful. And main question is, in helping to develop these transition neighborhoods, these nurturing neighborhoods for everyone, and including people, as he was saying, the invisible, marginalized groups, and because I'm a person with numerous disabilities and have been advocating for this for some time. And as he was saying, the dying, I call them the dying dinosaurs. And somebody says, you know, they're already dead. They're just not smart enough to fall over. Anyway, we are putting together in the New River Valley of Virginia, and some of us are getting ready to meet on Veterans Day next week to discuss nurturing neighborhoods in permaculture. So in Earth Care, People Care, Fair Share. So I just wanted to share that and let people know that that's happening in the New River Valley of Virginia. If they are interested in hooking up, I advise them to go to weareallfarmers.org and hook up with Crystal Marshall there.
Okay,
she's
Gail,
the one who's...
Yeah, that's fine. I think if we all did our event ads, we'd get a little bogged down, and I really appreciate what you're doing.
Okay, I apologize.
I think you gave us enough info, so really appreciate that work. Let's move on to... Go ahead.
I did have a question. My question is, how do we get people who are all marginalized to come together, because the bureaucracy doesn't allow that to happen? So that was my question.
Okay,
how do we get marginalized, invisible people to get together?
Great. Thank you for that. And I'm going to take a couple more questions before going to Mateo. So Susan Silber, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. everyone. These are pretty radical concepts, and I'm completely in support of them. But what is the language that we use to talk, with people who are not really familiar with these kinds of concepts? Number one, and number two, can you share some really super specific examples of success stories using the just transition model and concepts?
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'll do one more for now. Andrew Langford, go ahead.
Hi, Andrew here. Thanks for the talk so far. I'm in a rural area in Northern California where I'm looking at the dry farming of almonds to do something to replace the irrigated crops in Central Valley. And I can see that this is a project which could, if it was operating in the right sort of way, provide some opportunity for people who are currently, I really like the idea that the US is not short of farmers, but they're all currently workers, that it could be a route for workers to become land users in a more strategic way. And but I'm not sure how to make that happen, and I feel like I could use some mentoring from Mateo on this sort of work. And is that available?
Wonderful, thank you. So Mateo, over to you now, and then we still have a few people with their hands up to follow.
Great. Beautiful. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Andrew. Great questions all. I will try to weave an answer into the multiplicity of important questions you all raised. And Susan requested examples, and Gail mentioned her work in the River Valley. I'm going to name a couple of organizations that I feel are really doing amazing work as an initial point of reference. And again, I know Virginia and Kentucky aren't exactly the same place, but Appalachia, being a fairly large bioregion, has an expression of incredible just transition work happening through an organization called Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, particularly in eastern Kentucky, coal country, mountaintop removal country, where folks have by the thousands organized and literally been able to successfully not only confront the coal industry and mountaintop removal, but at the same time have been building multiple forms of regenerative economy that have, in essence, as I mentioned before, been both dismantling the bad while building the good. And folks, amongst other things, have really been building economies centered around worker-owned and run cooperatives that are centered not only in agriculture but many other manifestations, and are really rooted in the working-class rural communities of Appalachia that have borne the brunt of the extractive economy. So I name that as again, given the nature of this call and the limited amount of time, I think amongst other things, giving you a very cursory sense of who these organizations are and the work they're doing, and then inviting you to explore what it is that they're doing. And what the Kentuckians for the Commonwealth is doing so well, that I think is one of the things that I want to point out about where this is happening with high degrees of success is folks are amongst other things recognizing, again, not only the need to meet their needs through deploying their own labor, but are also really confronting power. So, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth has built a membership of thousands of people who have, amongst other things, engaged in civil disobedience to literally stop or prevent mountaintop removal, and have worked in conjunction coalitions with many of the different organizations that have been engaged in this struggle for a while now. So I think this part of what I think is important for us to highlight is that as we build kind of the alternatives, which really aren't alternatives, they're imperatives, right? If we're going to survive and thrive, it's not enough just to be building those, but we also need to be confronting power in a very direct way. And I think KFTC has really found that sweet spot and is building at scale. So Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. A second example I would give is the work that is happening in Richmond, California. There are multiple expressions. One which I'll name is, there are 3 organizations that I will call out in Richmond, California: Urban Tilth, APEN, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, and CBE, Communities for a Better Environment. What makes Richmond, California unique is that it's been a company town for almost a century. Chevron is headquartered there and has a major, its headquarters is now in San Ramon, California, which is nearby. But it's got one of the major oil refineries on the west coast there. And Chevron has had political control of Richmond, California for the longest time. And what folks are doing simultaneously is both confronting Chevron very directly and have reconfigured, amongst other things, the political makeup of city council, while at the same time Urban Tilth has very specifically reclaimed 20 plus acres of vacant land in Richmond and growing food as a way of getting folks to appreciate what a generative economy looks like. And now the organizations I named, plus many others, are starting a whole worker co-op incubator program to really get at everything from building out bicycle repair shops to many other things that get to the notion of what does it look like in a working class city, historically black and brown, for folks to be building out the forms of economy that we control in democratic, autonomous ways that creates full independence from this monopoly that has run our town, so that we can get to the point of not only shutting down that refinery because it's literally killing our kids for asthma and many other things, as our schools are 100 yards from the refinery, while at the same time us manifesting a degree of economic autonomy by building, again, as I said before, generative expressions of managing home well. So those are a couple of examples. I could give more. I think the final thing I'd like to say to your question, Gail, of how do we get marginalized folks involved, I think 2 parts to the answer. One is the 2 examples that I gave are 2 examples of many. So I think I want to challenge the notion that folks who are at the front lines aren't involved. They are incredibly involved. I think part of what the Transition Towns movement is challenged to step to is to appreciate that transition is happening, transition work is happening in many places. A lot of people simply aren't calling it that yet, or don't identify with the Transition Towns movement. So that's one. And second, I feel that a question at a recent talk where somebody was saying, hey, I work in this high school and we're trying to get the kids, it's primarily students of color, and we're trying to get them down with our recycling program, but we're having no success. And how do I, the notion was like, how do I bring people into my conception of how this work should be organized? I'm paraphrasing. And when I put forward this, the young people you're working with fully appreciate that this society and economy has deemed them as disposable. So that's your starting point. If you're just talking about it as kind of recycling stuff and zero waste versus consumer culture, but you're not connecting it to their lived experience, there's the rub. So again, it's about what I was saying before. The departure point of the analysis informs your journey and action. Folks fully understand how this economy has decided to deem them and their families completely disposable. And starting the conversation from that point, I think, builds a whole other trajectory to the realm of possibility.
Great. Thanks, Mateo. And I guess Andrew was also asking for maybe ongoing help after this call, if that is something that Movement Generation or yourself does engage in.
Yeah, I think the challenge that I think the respectful answer to that is, I think the relationship, the transition U.S., on a personal level that, again, Marisa, Caroline, and I have built is about, I think, really supporting what I think there are many folks within the Transition Towns movement who could step into that role, and I'm happy to offer some support. For me to commit to specific requests on this call is beyond the scope of my capacity. But I'm sure you understand.
I do, and I know I can put you two together for a conversation if needed to. So let's go on to a few more questions then. So Tom Cockley, go ahead.
Yes. Mateo mentioned something in regards to he feels that there should be land reform. My question is, what is he suggesting?
Okay,
great question.
And then Chris, don't have a last name showing, but you probably know that you put your hand up, so go ahead, Chris.
Hey, Caroline and Marisa. Thanks for organizing this. This is Chris in Montana. Mateo, I've got a question for you in particular. I've got another seminar in about an hour with John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, on how a man should know his place in the world and what he was born to contribute. So I guess I'm looking for a hard-hitting question to show we as a society told Whole Foods that using the prison inmates, who are mostly men, is unacceptable. How can I show that that's kind of a microcosm of America buying from Chinese gulags and the like?
Great question.
That makes sense.
Are there any more questions, or should I jump in?
I wanted to just check in with Cassandra. Cassandra, did you have your hand up? Cassandra, if you have a question, you can chime in. There we go.
Yes, I do have a question. Sorry about that. I'm interested because I'm involved with a board that's working an Indian reservation. If there's been any examples of transition work regarding Indian communities in the United States.
And that question's specifically for Mateo and the work that he's talking about, I believe. Is that right?
That's right.
Yes. All right. Great. So over to you, Mateo.
Great. I love all three questions. Thank you, Tom, Chris, and Cassandra. These are great. So I think when I talk about land reform, so I'll take them in order. To your question, Tom, I think one of the things that is missing in the United States when we talk about social movements and really getting into a deeper transformation from what is to what needs to be. When we look at other social movements in other parts of the country, of the world, I'm thinking specifically, say, of Brazil, the landless workers movement, or internationally Via Campesina, the largest social movement in the world, which is a kind of coordinated effort of peasant movements around the world. What they often say to allies in the U.S. is like, where is your land reform movement? You cannot manage home well unless you actually have autonomous democratic control of home. So when I talk about land reform, I literally mean like we need to challenge the notion of how private property came to be a sacrosanct notion in the U.S. That we in the Transition Towns movement talk a lot about the commons, and it's really commons versus enclosure, and enclosure is deeply rooted again in this colonial logic. Enclosure is the process of consolidation and control of land from commons to private property. And all enclosures must be enforced through violence, ultimately. So, when I talk about land reform, there's maybe three ways to think about the question. It's like, who owns the land? And how do we move it from few to the many? how is land used? Is it for purposes of private development or public benefit? And how is land governed, again? Through a private process, through a public process? Is it the commons? Those are central questions, but ultimately what we need to be doing on a massive scale is we need to be taking land back. We need to seize land. We need to make it better. We need to put it to productive use, and we need to protect it forever. And again, the MST, Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, is a great example of folks who are doing this at scale. Hundreds of thousands of families, millions of folks have identified idle land owned by huge landowners and occupied it in a very shared form, have not started just doing things individually, but really forming new expressions of how to organize human settlement that is about the we versus the me. Obviously, we could speak for hours about this, but I'm really glad you asked the question, Tom. It's one of the things I didn't get to. There's a lot more to be said there. But I do want to move to the other questions. Chris, that's amazing that you have this call. I mean, three things come to mind. One is what I didn't mention earlier, is that the folks who are working to challenge, confront, and abolish the prison industrial complex actually have been pressing Whole Foods very strongly, like social movements, particularly based in Texas, to call out Whole Foods for using prison labor, and it's become quite an embarrassment to the point that just recently Whole Foods has come out and said that as of April 2016, they will not have any products that are grown is not the right word, but y'all know what I mean by prison labor. So I'd start by, maybe on the call, commending the organizations that made this possible, because again, it was through confronting power and through organizing social movement work that this happened. It just happened just a couple of weeks ago. So it's not a done deal, but hopefully it's made this public pledge because they could see it was starting to be embarrassing. So I'd say calling out and congratulating those folks, and I can get that direct info for you quickly if you'd like. Number two is I would call them out about, why did you distribute food to the National Guard in Baltimore instead of supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, and what are you going to do to support the cause for Black Lives Matter? And call him out very directly. I think that would be a great question. I'd be very curious to see what he has to say. And number three, it's like, why do you continually bust any efforts to form unions in your shops? Like, dignity of the workplace is central to being in right relationship to home and place. How can you say you are good stewards of the land and earth if you aren't good stewards of the people who work in your shops? He will most definitely give you a very scripted line on unions on that answer, but because they pay union-busting lawyers millions and millions of dollars to fight labor organizing their shops all the time. But nevertheless, I think that's really important to state. So those are three things that come to mind. And to your question, Cassandra, yes. So I've made an allusion to the Climate Justice Alliance, which is an alliance of almost 50 organizations at a national level who are all engaged in just transition work around the country. And the website can be found at ourpowercampaign.org. The Climate Justice Alliance runs the Our Power Campaign. I named Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. I named APEN, Asian Pacific Environmental Network. The Black Mesa Water Coalition in the Southwest, in Navajo and Hopi land in Arizona, is a key leading organization in the Climate Justice Alliance and is doing amazing work, has successfully confronted both coal mines and coal power processing plants that, amongst other things, have depleted water tables severely, polluted groundwater, and have both been able to shut some of these down while at the same time rebuilding regenerative forms of traditional sheep herding economy and other forms of economy that are at the root of what has been the way, or regenerative economy has been organized there. So yes, the Black Mesa Water Coalition is a great example. Leaders in the Climate Justice Alliance. I could say a lot more about the work they're doing, taking, for example, land that has been essentially destroyed by coal companies, meaning they're extremely polluted, and Black Mesa Water Coalition is looking to building worker-owned, fully community-controlled, solar power plants at scale on that land, recognizing there isn't much else that can be built there, unfortunately. So yes, that is an example, and there are others. The Indigenous Environmental Network is also part of the Climate Justice Alliance. Close allies of ours here at Movement Generation have been key in the struggle against Keystone XL, and key in really raising up the experience of folks in the Athabascan region in Western Canada, where tar sands development happens. So Indigenous Environmental Network would be another go-to organization.
Great. Thank you, Mateo. I just want to invite people, we have a few minutes left, if others have some burning questions or comments to bring to the table. Now's your chance, and press 1 on your keypad. Gail, you've got your hand up again, so let's hear a question from you.
Actually, I thought I was muting myself, but I will ask another question if that's okay.
Yeah, if you could be brief.
Okay, I will be brief. Okay, so marginalized societies, and then are there people in this area that anyone knows of for creating community land trusts?
And Gail, refresh us what your area is again.
It's Central Appalachia, Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, Southwest Virginia.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another question. I don't know how to pronounce this name, so please forgive me in advance. And it's FERENC. And you're mic'd if you'd like to go ahead. And tell us how to say your name, please.
Oh, my name's Ferenc, and can you hear me?
Yes, very well, thank you.
Okay. Anyways, I went to a transition town meeting years ago with Sophie Banks, Nourish John Grande, which was supremely inspirational. It changed my life, and we were asked a bunch of questions, so Joanna Macy exercises. But I thought one thing that we neglected was crowdfunding for the teenagers who are interested in the movement. What would happen if we gave a whole bunch of teenagers who are interested in these things $50 or $100 and told them, put at least $10 or $20 into buying garden seeds and growing some beans and other greens in one of your neighbor's backyards, and then come back in a year and tell us what you did, and let's have a big party celebrating. To get a new generation of leaders, we're actually going to need to have people not just saying, yes, boss, 3 bags full. We're going to have to let people make mistakes and figure out what works and how to serve their communities. And so over the past couple of years, I've started gardening for one old lady who I used to work with, and we put in a whole pile of beans and greens in her backyard. And then we put in another garden for another neighbor, which was originally 300 square feet. Now we're up to 5. And now we've just started another garden for another neighbor, which is going to be 800 square feet when we get rid of those miserable chafer beetles. And I'm learning a lot through trying to grow food for myself, my family, my property owner, and the neighbors come by and enjoy what we're doing. So this, I think, has a tremendous potential, like just doing direct action in your community and getting people who are around you who know even better than you do what to do, getting their advice and getting their participation. Right. So instead of telling people what to, okay, go for it.
Let's. I think we got the gist of it. So thank you. I want to get the rest of the questions in here. quickly. So Mateo, should I just go ahead? There's a few more. Do you want to hear those all or respond?
If folks can be very brief, yeah, let's get what's remaining, and then I will, if you think makes sense, I'll respond to some of them and make kind of my parting statements. If that's where we're at.
Great. So Ian, go ahead. Ian Sawyer.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. And keep it brief.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Mateo. My question is, so just from my analysis, it really seems like as white people and as privileged people, we view the world, we can never understand the lived experience of people of color and especially oppressed communities. And it almost seems like as white people, we're more encouraged to find immediate solutions versus listening and actually falling under the leadership of whether it's Black Power, Black Lives Matter movement, or just listening to these organizations that are doing important social work, and we might deem that they're not doing the environmental work. So I would just wanted to hear your take on what does that listening process look like, and what do we need to do to reform what it means to find leadership and who we deem as capable leaders. Thank you.
Wonderful question. Thank you. And we've got 3 more. We'll do these fairly quickly, I think. Joshua Angelo, go ahead. Joshua?
Hello. Hey, Mateo. Gracias. Gracias, amigo. My question kind of follows with what Ethan was saying, but more directed around like the white savior mentality, or coming from a place of white privilege, is like, how do we save the brown people? How do we save the brown people? Like, how do you, as an organization that works with people of color, combat that, or more so ally yourselves with helping people see that they're not the savior?
Great, thank you. Hannah, and then we'll have Marissa, and then back to you, Mateo. Go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, great. Mateo, I'm very excited. We're going to be working to launch the North American version of Permaculture magazine, and I wanted to ask if I could be in touch with you to have you do an article and really share this amazing work that you're doing and more examples with people, and really help inspire both the transition movement and the permaculture movement around this great work you're doing and the words of people.
So I guess we'll be hearing back from Mateo on that one too, and I can potentially put you both in touch. And last is Marissa. Go ahead.
Thanks, Caroline. I just wanted to mention a few resources for some of the topics that have come up. So first of all, on land reform and community land trusts, if folks are interested in that, that's one of my passions as well, and I would love to share resources with you, so you can email me, marissa@transitionus.org. I'll also be putting together a list of resources on anti-oppression and white privilege, and some great tools and pieces for reflecting on that, which I'll send to everyone on this call. And then the piece around youth, I got to attend the International Transition Conference Youth Day a couple months ago, and we came up with some great suggestions on how to support youth leadership in our movement. So there's a blog post that I wrote kind of highlighting some of the takeaways from that, which you can find on our website or again by emailing me. Thank you all.
Great, thank you. So Mateo, back to you for some answers to those questions, and then leave you some time for closing comments.
Beautiful. Thank you again. All of these questions are incredibly rich, and I'm really appreciating and growing from this conversation. I'm glad that Marisa named those resources, so I will maybe feed her some to add to that. I think it was Cassandra's question. Before I forget, I looked it up very quickly. Wanted to get back to Chris Montana around this fortuitous conversation with folks, the CEO from Whole Foods. The organization that led the protests that happened in Houston, it's called End Mass Incarceration Houston, and their founder is called Michael Allen. So again, if I wanted to call, I'd call out, hey, big ups to end mass incarceration Houston. They got you to do the right thing. So I just wanted to name them. I didn't fully catch it was Ian or Ethan, but both, your question and Joshua Angelo's question, I think are incredibly important. Thank you both for naming it. I think, there's a couple of different pieces to this. The central is that for those of us who have privilege, humility is a central ingredient to how we approach the work. And I think, Joshua Angelo named it, hit it on the head. There is a white savior mentality that needs to be confronted within us and around us. And we need to, I think, start from the place of appreciating that folks who've been bearing the brunt of the damage of this economy have been resisting it for hundreds of years. And there's tremendous wisdom in that struggle that we need to look to, both as forms of inspiration, but as departure points for the work that we're doing now. That should not incapacitate us. That should not paralyze us. It should just be an appreciation that, the notion, for example, just to state an obvious control mythology that's simply not true, like, people of color care less about the environment than white folks, is just patently untrue. But it's been built into popular culture with deep intention. So we not only need to complicate it, we need to make visible what is invisibilized, which is that folks that live in front of power plants and next to coal mines and so on have been fighting to protect home for a really long time. Or if we look at permaculture, permaculture is a new concept that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. And it's simply a methodology put together by folks who had the incredible privilege of traveling around the world and looking at how indigenous place-based cultures have been tending home forever. And that's great. That's a really wonderful contribution. But to then confuse and conflate and think that that's like a white innovation is a tremendous error in process, just to name the obvious. So I think it's looking around us and seeing what those front lines of ecological justice struggles and climate justice struggles playing out in our community are. I named, and I'm inviting you, for example, to think of struggles around displacement and gentrification in your urban centers as these. So expanding your notion of around this if you haven't done so already. And then I think part of what, again, I apologize, Ian or Ethan, if I got your name wrong. Part of, I think, what you were alluding to correctly is like, as white allies, then our task is to challenge the blind spots where we see them within white communities that aren't appreciating this importance. And I found it really instructive and informative when I read the answers that you all put forth as a collective to, you were asked when you registered to say, is your transition work already connecting issues of race, class, and ecology? I got some really inspiring answers. I got some really sincere answers, like not yet, but I would like to. And then there were a couple of answers like well, I'm going to read them out. It said, race and class makes little difference to me. I am focused on how we as a species live with the rest of the planet. Or, I'm more interested in the ecological aspects than the non-scientific human classifications of race and class. I feel that these are emblematic expression of this privilege playing out in our movement. That is, if we have the privilege to ignore realities that then they are killing whole communities, that's what it is. It's a privilege. And to call it irrelevant to the work that we're doing is something that needs to be challenged frontally. So I think I appreciate your questions because I think you're inviting us to do that as a movement, and I think that's part of what this call is about. And I think maybe I'll end by just reminding us that to get to where we want to get to is going to involve struggle. And none of us like struggle. Struggle is actually really unpleasant. But we are not going to dismantle this banks and tanks economy and be able to build the good in its place without resistance from those who profit from this profit and growth economy. And Frederick Douglass said it well. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate its agitation are people who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And I want to end with this because I think there is a tendency within parts of the transition towns movement that thinks that if we only build the good where we live, we're going to be fine, and that's simply not true. If we're going to bring down the Monsantos and the Shells and the Chevrons, we're going to need to struggle. If we're going to dismantle the prison industrial complex and dismantle white supremacy and dismantle patriarchy, there's going to be a struggle. And the sweet spot is how we build expression of love and care and new forms of social organization that are based on cooperation and competition that inspire thousands of people to appreciate that, yes, that is what feels right in my heart and my body and in my hands when I build that. And that in turn is going to make me step forth to challenge what needs to be challenged to get where we need to get to.
Wow, thank you so much, Mateo, for spending time with us and for relaying a lot of information, really thoughtful and some good examples and a lot of things that we can continue to learn from. So deep appreciation to you and to all of the work you're doing in the world across the nation and all the alliances you're connecting with and just how you're rippling so much into so many of these networks. So yay, and just wanted to, just deeply appreciate you.
Thank you, Caroline. I appreciate the two of you for organizing this courageous conversation, and I appreciate all of you who joined this call and all the important questions that were raised, and I'm excited to see where it will take us.
Yes, and just along that line, we hope to, or we plan to, host more of these calls, and we thought we would conduct this first one, kind of get a sense of the questions and the interest, and so we'll move forward and appreciate any feedback or ideas from any of you.